All right, welcome back to my channel, Fear the Northman. I'm excited. It's Friday. Doing things a little different for a while. My wife and I, we bought some chickens, well, some chicks, and we want to eventually harvest our own eggs and all that good stuff. And where I normally record, which is in my wonderful kitchen, our chickens are just on the other side of that wall, and you hear them constantly. So to avoid the sound of chickens, whatever, they're getting bigger, throughout the video, I'm going to be recording in my car for a little bit, so you're going to see the dash lights, how it looks. It's going to be a little different. We're going to go a little guerrilla, but that's all right. Today's episode, Friday, Get to Know the Northman, talking about wrestling for the rest of this month. And this episode is centered around the reason that faces are so good is precisely because the heels that they face are that much better. If you're someone who's followed wrestling, maybe you've had a chance to see some really great feuds or some feuds that really invoked an emotion in you that was real and authentic. For me, and I talked about it in my first video over this month when I talked about my favorite top five wrestlers, I can remember the initial feud that Mankind, of course, Mick Foley, had with Undertaker, and just how, for me, of course, I was much younger then, but for me at the time, it really pulled out of me something that was very authentic and real, because of just, for me at that time, how scary Mankind was. I just remember being utterly terrified of him and frightened of the fact that here's this guy who seemingly can manhandle the Undertaker and really just take all the abuse that the Undertaker can dish out and keep coming. For me, that was very frightening, but it was because they did a really good job of making Mankind this villain, this threat to the dead man that was authentic and real. And throughout wrestling, there's been other examples like that. Now, again, professional wrestling is like anything else. Sometimes it's really good, sometimes it's okay, sometimes it's really bad. But when the heels have been right, when the heels have been positioned to be as bad as they can be, or invoke the hatred in people, that is necessary to sell the face, it's really, really great. There's great stories. One of the things I'm excited about doing this whole series is that, excuse me, I'm going back and just watching old interviews and watching old wrestling, some of them from the Territory days, which I encourage you, if you don't know about the Territory days, or if you do know a little bit about it, that whole era, the interviews of people talking about it from back in the day, or the actual footage, it's all wonderful. It's fantastic, across the board. It's really a moment in time that most likely will never come back, and it's really something. It's very interesting. It's a lot of fun. But there was a wrestler at one point, the Junkyard Dog. He ended up going over to the WWF near the end of his career, but in Mid-South, I believe, Mid-South Wrestling, which was Cowboy Bill Watts out of Texas. The Junkyard Dog was, as a black man, was a avenue into that market, into parts of Louisiana where it's predominantly an ethnic audience, black, Puerto Rican, that Mid-South was happy to have, because it gave them a foothold in another market that wasn't, the country white guys. But to those people in, those areas in Louisiana and the areas where it was predominantly more black and more Hispanic or Latino, the Junkyard Dog was it. He was the guy. And at the time, there were moments where he and in the WWF, he was Hacksaw Jim Duggan, but I believe in Mid-South, he was just Jim Duggan. They would feud, they would go back and forth, and there's a hilarious story that Jim Duggan told, where at one point, he's at the event, he's at the arena, or whatever the case may be, either getting ready for the show or after. And this old black woman, maybe middle-aged, comes back and, "Are you Jim Duggan?" And he says, "Yeah, I'm Jim Duggan." And she goes, "I got something for you, white boy." and pulls out a little 38 and goes to shoot him, and he rushes her and grabs the gun and says, "She's got a gun!" And so like then security had to come back, and they obviously got her out. But for her, the face was the Junkyard Dog, and she hated Jim Duggan, and it was so real to her. She was literally going to shoot him backstage. There's another story where, if you have never heard of the Midnight Express, there's actually 2 incarnations of them. The one that I'm talking about is the one with Jim Cornette, who's arguably the greatest heel manager there's ever been, arguably. But there was one scenario, again, in a very rough area. This was more like rough white redneck, very backwoods. But a guy called in to the promotion and said, "Hey, are there any front row seats?" And they said, "No, it's all sold out." And he said, "Well, I want a front row seat because I want to shoot Jim Cornette." They said, "Well, what?" And then they somewhat took it seriously. There were cops there anyways, because at the time, the Midnight Express, wherever they went, they did a very good job of getting heat. And that's a term for back in the day, which it still happens nowadays, where people are very interested in that character. They want to see that character get hurt or get beat, getting heat. Getting over is where a character gets over with the audience, becomes either a face or an anti-hero, much to how Stone Cold Steve Austin did. A heel can get over, but many times I think, and I'm a novice in all this, I'm just a fan looking from the outside in. I think when a heel gets over, when a heel is really into they're in the swing of it, and who they are as a character is really coming out, and people are really into it, I would say in that moment they have heat. So that's different. That's semantics. Whatever. Anyways, the guy ends up showing up to this event who wants to shoot. I believe it's Jim Cornette who wants to shoot Jim Cornette. And, of course, there's no front row seats. Well, he rushes I don't know what it's called, the barrier, I don't know, and pulls his gun out, and all the cops that were there that they hired anyways, because there were threats of riots, and it was getting violent, just crazy white redneck hilljacks. They rushed him, and, Cornette almost got shot. I mean, the guy had his gun raised, and I think an officer knocked it down, and they tackled him and wrestled the gun away from him. But the Midnight Express and Jim Cornette, much to the same way that Jim Duggan was for that black woman, they were so intense and so prolific in their heeldom, if that's even a word, that this guy really wanted to kill Jim Cornette, which, if you really want to see greatness, go watch old Jim Cornette promos. I'd encourage you to go watch the old one in Mid-South, where he's talking to Cowboy Bill Watts, and there's a thing going on where the Midnight did something wrong. Of course, they were the heels, and Jim Cornette's character was a rich kid who always gets money from his wealthy mother. And Cowboy Bill Watts said, they've leveled against you the heaviest fine I've ever seen. Of course, this is in the early 80s, so this is back in the day. He said, Mid-South has leveled against you a fine of $5,000. And Jim Cornette, it's just amazingly well done. I'd encourage you to go check it out, because it'll make you fall in love with Jim Cornette as a villain. But Jim Cornette says, "You know what $5,000 is to me, Bill Watts? It's a phone call home to mother." And that actually starts to set up the feud that Jim Cornette and Cowboy Bill Watts had, which was utterly fantastic as well. It was just totally amazing. But the point to that is, it's the anger and it's the frustration that people feel towards the heel, or the fear. Hogan, during his tenure in the WWF, when he was the heartbeat of the economic, movement there, the heels were always guys that were bigger than him or as big, that were truly physically scary, that, the Hulkster could only beat by tapping into Hulkamania and hulking out and winning. And it was very gimmicky. People loved it. But the reality of the hatred of those people he was going up against. Like, I didn't hate Andre the Giant. I just thought, how is he going to beat him? Andre's huge. But when a heel is done right, people hate the heel. They want nothing more than to see the heel lose or see the heel run out of the territory or the building or whatever. And that's when it's done correctly. And it's happened a few times. You know, Jim Cornette's one of them. Jerry Lawler was actually a great heel for many years. But really, it all depends on where you're at, the market you're at, and really who you back and who you're into. I would argue, for me, that the greatest heel in history up to this point has actually been Vince McMahon. The Stone Cold Steve Austin era. Of course, the Stone Cold Steve Austin era is really eclipsed by the fact that it was the Attitude Era. Of course, at that time, you had Triple H, The Rock, Shawn Michaels, I believe, came back, The Undertaker, of course, Stone Cold. Leading into the Stone Cold era, you had, of course, Stone Cold's first real break was when he beat Jake the Snake Roberts. That was the creation of the birth of Stone Cold Steve Austin, Austin 316, excuse me. And of course, the early years of Stone Cold, really when WWF was probably losing to WCW in the Monday Night Wars, was initially the feud was with Bret the Hitman Hart. But during the Stone Cold era, the WWF, and this is Vince's own words, had never sold more T-shirts, merchandise. The viewership was higher as far as ticket sales when he was at the height, when Stone Cold Steve Austin was at the height of his success. And if you remember, a lot of the frustration that Stone Cold, the character, was focused on or was targeted against, was in fact Vince McMahon. Yes, he wrestled other people, but many times throughout that whole era, Vince was getting guys to wrestle him to try to beat him for the belt, the corporation, yada yada yada, all that stuff. Really, all great angles. But Vince was the heel. Vince and Shane O'Mac, they were the heels. I saw a great clip the other day, and I totally forgot about it, where he comes down in like a Zamboni or a beer truck or something. He did this twice, but in this time, there's cops all in the ring, and he climbs up on the truck, runs, jumps over the rope and the cops, and clotheslines Vince McMahon to just start fighting him. He hated him, and really, Vince was the reason, in my opinion, that Stone Cold got over the way he did. Yes, Stone Cold is a great anti-hero. He's a great sort of negative face is the wrong way to say it, but he got over like crazy. But he wasn't a baby face. He wasn't a Stinger. You know what I'm saying? He wasn't a Hulk Hogan, but he got over. But I really do feel, in seeing those old clips now, yes, he connected to a very country rural audience with the way he spoke. Yes, people liked his tough guy approach, but really, and Vince said this, that was a moment in time where a lot of the viewership of WWF or WWE, whatever they were obviously, wrestling's predominantly always male. It's the largest audience demographics, probably male. But there were a lot of men who felt dominated by their job and by their employer, and they got a chance, and I spoke about this earlier in another video, but they got a chance to every Monday night and or every other Monday night to see an employee beat his boss's ass. And that was what was so great. And Vince McMahon did a wonderful job of being the antithesis to Stone Cold Steve Austin. Stone Cold Steve Austin having the appearance of a blue-collar worker, although very clever, not necessarily eloquent, although not super athletic and tough, whereas Vince is this loquacious guy, has a lot of money, has all the power, etc., etc., and Stone Cold gets to give him the stunner every other week or whatever the case may be. And of course, then Vince would come out and ruin his night, do whatever he could. Great. They did a great job too with Stone Cold of bringing in like industrial equipment. You may not remember, but at one point, Vince's prize Corvette or whatever it was a convertible. Stone Cold filled it up with wet cement, and it was just great things like that really made the people fall in love, I believe, more so with Stone Cold. Because Stunning Steve Austin had a wonderful career leading up to the WWF in WCW, and I believe also in Jim Crockett. He was actually with the Hollywood Blondes. He was partnered with Brian Pillman for years. Actually, that was one of the first story arcs that they did with Stone Cold, I believe, in the WWF. They brought Brian Pillman back before his untimely death, where he and Austin were feuding, and Austin goes to his house to fight him, and he's got a gun, and they shoot. Just amazing stuff. But Austin had a super successful career leading up to it. Not that he was a superstar, but he was making good money. He was living well. And Kevin Nash had said that by the time the WWF really understood Austin and really brought him on and made him the guy, at that point, Kevin Nash's example of Austin was he had 150,000 miles on him at that point, which is probably true. But Vince McMahon, really very genius of him, took this real vibe that was in America and put it into wrestling and made himself the villain, made himself the heel, because the truth is, who else was going to be? I mean, who else was going to be the heel to Stone Cold Steve Austin? Stone Cold, again, wasn't a guy that was being friendly to the fans per se. He wasn't, he was talking as much trash as he could. So who could have been his character's heel? It had to be someone that wasn't blue collar. It had to be someone that was country club. And that's the genius of Vince McMahon. And I mean, I would say that that makes Vince the greatest heel ever, because of the people tuning in to see this blue collar guy get revenge every single week on this white collar billionaire, right? Which at the time he wasn't a billionaire, but that's either here nor there. That's either here nor there, excuse me. And it really does go back to the point that we need in wrestling, we need to have a heel that really invokes fear, anger, and frustration in the audience, because without it, the babyface can't get over. Because really, the babyface's character, in my opinion, doesn't really have a lot of depth. It's just a good guy or a good gal. But it's the heel that can really have depth. I mean, people loved Ric Flair when he would feud against Sting and Ricky the Dragon Steamboat, of course. The constant feuds that he had with Dusty Rhodes. People loved Ric Flair because he was overtly cocky. He was in the same wealth class as like Vince McMahon, but he was like an asshole about it. The Rolex wearing, having a hard time keeping these alligators down. People hated him, but then you also had the fans that loved him. So it was it really sold the reality of the feud. And it's my belief that without great heels in professional wrestling, whether it's the WWE, AEW, NWA, whatever the case may be, without a great heel, you really have nothing. You have to have, one artist said, you have to have dark and shadows to show depth, and that's 100% correct. In the world of professional wrestling, where it is choreographed, it is staged, but it's also very physical and real, without the characters that are bringing the heat of frustration and anger to the audience, there's no depth to the show. There's no depth to the story. It's just all fluff. It isn't real. So this has been my Friday's episode on professional wrestling. I'm a huge fan. Right now, again, I'm trying to get into AEW. I just haven't pulled the trigger yet. I probably need to. They're a little bit ridiculous at times for me. I did love Jake the Snake coming back. That was amazing. But again, right now, a lot of my love of wrestling is very nostalgic. I'm nostalgic. Excuse me. I'm watching a lot of stuff from the Territory days. Mid-South was. I'm loving Mid-South more and more. And of course, the Midnight Express are great. And but also too, you get those great stories from the Territory days, leading into Jim Crockett, leading into WCW, where you had those moments of like the first black champion with Ron Simmons, not Russell Simmons. I apologize for that. And of course, Rocky Maivia, Dwayne The Rock Johnson. His father just recently passed, I believe, but obviously he was one of the first. He was actually the first black tag team champions. So that era is very interesting to me and very exciting. But this has been my episode for Friday. I hope you liked it. If you did, like, share, subscribe, hit the notification bell. We're going to come back next week with another video on wrestling. I'm excited about it. This whole month's been fantastic so far. Even with the coronavirus, we're still pressing through. We're not stopping. Even though I got to record in my car because I got chickens at the house, we aren't stopping. Don't let nothing stop you. Find a way to get to where you're going. If you liked it, comment in the comments. If you hated it, send it to someone you hate. I'll see you next week.